They met on a romantic movie set in the vibrant Paris of the 1970s. Chemistry sparked between them, but life had other plans. They were abruptly torn apart at the end of the film production. For 50 long years, their lives went in different directions. Decades later, Sophie, now an artist and psychologist in Italy, visited Paris for an art exhibition. And by chance, Ethan, a successful filmmaker, was in Paris for a film retrospective. While browsing online, Ethan stumbled upon a photo of Sophie, reigniting feelings long forgotten. They meet again, but old wounds and new responsibilities threaten their second chance at love. It was an afternoon like so many others in Paris, but for Sophie, a rising star in the world of cinema, that day would mark the beginning of something extraordinary. The film studio in the heart of the city buzzed with activity, as assistants hurried back and forth, adjusting cameras and setting up scenes. Sophie, wrapped in a cloak of anticipation and insecurity, observed everything around her, absorbing every detail. There was a mixture of excitement and nervousness in the air, but what unsettled her most wasn't the weight of the role she had secured, but rather the presence that dominated the studio, Ethan. He was a young filmmaker, but he already carried with him an aura of quiet authority, as if he knew exactly what he wanted from each scene, from every camera movement, and from every gesture of the actors. Sophie's eyes followed him almost involuntarily, as if his presence were magnetic. There was something about him that drew her in, something she couldn't quite define, but that made her feel an inexplicable connection, even though they were practically strangers. During the shoot, the relationship between director and actress developed with surprising naturalness. Ethan watched Sophie's performances with an intensity that left her unsettled, as though he was searching for something in her expressions that only he could see. And Sophie, in turn, pushed herself harder with each scene, wanting not only to impress him but also to understand what lay behind that firm, yet distant gaze. Paris in the 1970s was a vibrant city, filled with social and artistic change, and both Sophie and Ethan seemed immersed in this creative fervor. However, there was something deeper in their relationship, something that went beyond the cameras. A subtle tension began to form, growing with each day of filming. Sophie felt that behind each of Ethan's directions, there was an attempt to get closer to her, a search for something that transcended mere work. As the weeks passed, this connection intensified. Sophie noticed that even when she wasn't on set, her thoughts drifted to Ethan. She wondered what he saw in her, what he expected when he asked her to bring more truth to her lines. There was something hidden there, something they both seemed reluctant to explore. And yet, this reluctance only made everything more powerful. When filming finally ended, the farewell was abrupt. There were no long closing speeches, no promises of future reunions, just the usual routine of packing up equipment and saying goodbye. Sophie felt a strange melancholy as she left the set for the last time. The bond that had formed between her and Ethan, though subtle, seemed to have been severed before it could fully bloom. As night fell over Paris, she walked alone along the banks of the Seine, trying to understand the feelings that were consuming her. What would have happened if they had had more time? What could have been if she had found a way to express what she truly felt? Sophie didn't know, but deep down she felt that this story was far from over. And so, in the shadows of Paris's glittering lights, as the river flowed silent and steady, Sophie left that chapter of her life with Ethan behind, not knowing that fate still had another page for them to write. After that last day on set, life took unexpected turns for both Sophie and Ethan. As so often happens, the end of a project also marked the end of a phase in their lives, and the promising connection between them was interrupted without room for a meaningful goodbye. Sophie, driven by a desire to distance herself from the frenzy of Paris and find new directions for her career, accepted an opportunity that would take her to Italy. It was an irresistible offer, and the young actress, still on the rise, saw in that country the perfect backdrop for her reinvention. In Italy, Sophie embarked on a new phase of self-discovery. The serene beauty of the Tuscan landscapes and the depth of Italian artistic culture captivated her immediately. Over the years, she gradually distanced herself from the bright lights of cinema and found refuge in other pursuits. The desire to act, which once consumed her, was replaced by a growing passion for psychology and visual arts. The stage was now a different one, quieter and more introspective. Sophie became a figure of prominence in her new life, known as a psychologist with unique sensitivity and a painter of remarkable talent. Although it seemed she had completely reinvented herself, something inside her remained unchanged. A dormant memory, a quiet echo of that brief period in Paris. Meanwhile, in another part of Europe, Ethan remained in his homeland, where his filmmaking career flourished. As the years passed, he became a respected name in the French film scene, known for his ability to capture the beauty and complexity of life in his films and photography. Ethan, however, didn't just pursue professional success. His personal life also became intertwined with the commitments and responsibilities that time inevitably brings. He married, had children, and over the years, experienced the joys and sorrows of family life. Yet, even amidst this new phase, he carried with him a vague sense of incompleteness, as if something essential had been left behind. In moments of silence, in the gaps between one film and another, or during the days he spent immersed in photography, Ethan found himself briefly recalling Sophie. It wasn't a painful memory, but it wasn't something he could forget entirely either. Time passed for both of them relentlessly and quietly. The geographical distance between Sophie and Ethan mirrored the growing gulf between their lives. What could have been a decisive encounter had instead become a distant memory, almost dreamlike. Their paths, though so different, continued in opposite directions, and with each passing year, it seemed increasingly unlikely that their lives would cross again. And yet, somewhere deep inside, in the most hidden corners of their memories, both Sophie and Ethan carried that brief moment in Paris as an unfinished piece of their pasts. On the surface, their lives were full of accomplishments and responsibilities. Sophie had become a woman of wisdom and presence, Ethan a renowned filmmaker. But fate, always capricious, had a quiet surprise in store for both of them. Even though separated by decades and by choices that took them to faraway places, both felt in different ways that the story they had started together hadn't been fully written. The decades that followed shaped Sophie and Ethan in different ways, but their journeys, though apart, reflected a strange symmetry. Both lived full lives filled with professional and personal achievements, yet each carried a silent, invisible gap that had never quite been filled. Sophie had settled in Florence, immersed in the tranquility of the Tuscan hills, where the lush green and golden skies of the late afternoons inspired her art and her work as a psychologist. Florence became her home, a city that echoed the internal renaissance she had experienced. As she drifted away from cinema, Sophie discovered a new form of expression, channeling her emotions and complexities through her paintings. Her abstract, deeply emotional pieces garnered attention in galleries across the city. The public admired the intensity of her work, but few knew that behind each brushstroke was a soul still in search, a search Sophie could never quite name, but that was intrinsically tied to a past she had left behind in Paris. Her work as a psychologist also reflected this desire to understand what lay hidden in the hearts of others. Clients sought her out for her unique sensitivity, as if Sophie, more than anyone, understood what it meant to hold something deep inside. By helping others navigate the labyrinths of their emotions, Sophie also found some peace, though never complete resolution. In moments of solitude, especially on quiet winter mornings, she found herself briefly reliving the memories of Ethan. Not painful, but not forgotten either. His intense gaze during those filming days, and the whispers of a connection that had never fully bloomed. Yet she always pushed those memories aside, believing that time had erased them. Meanwhile, back in Paris, Ethan had cemented his place as one of the most respected filmmakers of his generation. His films captured the fleeting essence of life, the passage of time, love, loss, themes that in many ways reflected his own experience. He won awards, traveled the world with his photography exhibitions, and his films were celebrated by critics. But despite the accolades, there was something in him that still felt incomplete. There was a silent weight in his chest, something he never mentioned to even his closest friends or family. Ethan had married, and while his marriage brought moments of happiness, it couldn't dispel the feeling that something crucial was missing. Over time, he accepted this absence as an inevitable part of adulthood, like a compromise with reality. Still, the feeling never quite disappeared. In moments of introspection, particularly when looking at his old photographs, the image of Sophie resurfaced in his mind with surprising clarity. The memory of Sophie wasn't one of pain, but of curiosity, like an unresolved question echoing in the background of his consciousness. He wondered where she was now, what her life had become. The last he had heard of her was shortly after the film ended, when a mutual friend mentioned that Sophie had left France to pursue other dreams. Since then, their lives had taken parallel paths, never crossing again, but always watching each other from afar, as though the universe had decided to keep them connected by an invisible thread. Years passed, and as age began to weigh on him, Ethan felt an increasing urgency to revisit certain moments from his past. There was a sense of incompleteness that he could no longer ignore. Yet that restlessness was overshadowed by the responsibilities life had placed upon him. His youngest daughter, Claire, had developed a fragile health condition that demanded constant care. Ethan's focus shifted entirely to her, once again postponing the possibility of revisiting what he considered a memory of youth. And so Sophie and Ethan's lives continued on parallel tracks, like the rails of a train that, though close, never meet. Both were surrounded by success and respect, but somewhere in their souls, they kept alive the memory of a brief connection that had never been fully forgotten. They were, at once, prisoners of time and accomplices to a destiny that, though dormant, still seemed to hold surprises. One spring afternoon, fate began to rewrite Sophie and Ethan's story in a way neither of them could have predicted. The world had changed significantly since they last saw each other. Social media, now ubiquitous, connected people in ways that once seemed impossible. Ethan, as a filmmaker, had resisted getting involved with digital platforms for a long time, preferring direct contact with his art and his audience. But with Claire's health demanding more of his attention at home, he gradually found himself drawn into the online universe. One day, while browsing the internet without any particular goal in mind, something caught his attention. An old photograph appeared on a page he followed. It was an image from an art exhibition in Florence, showing a woman standing in front of one of her paintings. At first, Ethan was struck by the beauty of the abstract art that filled the canvas. But then something familiar gripped him. The woman's eyes, her features, her posture. It was like a spark igniting deep within his memory. It was Sophie. His heart raced. He couldn't be mistaken. The photo seemed recent, showing Sophie older now, but with the same intense, mysterious gaze from all those years ago. The surprise washed over him. What was she doing in Florence? How had he never known more about her life after all this time? The curiosity that had long been dormant resurfaced with overwhelming force. Driven by the sudden need to reconnect with that forgotten piece of his past, Ethan began researching. He found Sophie's profile on social media, where she shared glimpses of her life as an artist and psychologist. She seemed so vibrant, so full of life, that he was filled with a mix of admiration and nostalgia. The smile in some of her photos, the fragments of her reflections on art and life, revealed a woman who had lived intensely, but who still carried a depth that Ethan recognized all too well. Without thinking too much about the consequences, Ethan decided to send her a message. It wasn't a long letter or a text laden with emotions, just a few simple, almost formal words. "Sophie, it's Ethan, the director of the film we made in Paris so many years ago. I saw your paintings and thought I'd say hello. How are you? Time seemed to crawl after he sent the message. He didn't know if she would reply. Maybe Sophie had completely forgotten him, or maybe that connection he held onto in his memory no longer meant anything to her. The weight became a daily restlessness, but at the same time, he tried not to get his hopes up. After all, what could a few messages be after half a century of silence? Days later, Sophie's reply arrived. It was brief but surprisingly warm. She remembered him too and was intrigued that he had found her online. What had started as a simple exchange of memories soon blossomed into something deeper. The conversation flowed naturally, as if the years hadn't passed, and both realized that the brief moment of connection they'd shared on set was still alive, somewhere inside them. Sophie was surprised to learn that Ethan had recognized her after all this time, but at the same time, something inside her seemed to have been waiting for this reunion, even if it was virtual. The memories of 1970s Paris, the glow of youth, and the silent intensity of that connection surfaced once more, now wrapped in a veil of nostalgia and longing. What began as occasional messages turned into regular exchanges. Sophie shared stories of her life in Italy, about her career as a psychologist and artist. Ethan, in turn, talked about his journey in film, and more cautiously, about his personal life, briefly mentioning his daughter Claire's fragile health. And although their words were careful, the old flame they had carried in their hearts seemed to ignite once more, though timidly. Yet, as these exchanges grew more frequent, a dilemma began to emerge in both of their minds. What did this reunion mean after so many years? Could the past truly be revisited? What would they do with this newfound space they had found in each other, now in such a different stage of their lives? Both had established lives, inescapable responsibilities, and yet what they had rediscovered seemed to have a power that defied both time and reason. Ethan knew that sooner or later, destiny would force them to make a choice. For now, their reunion was virtual safe, but a part of him longed to see her again, to finally confront the feelings that time had not erased, but merely postponed. A few weeks after resuming contact, Sophie was invited to an art exhibition in Paris. The event, which celebrated contemporary artists, would be an opportunity for her to present her work to a new audience, in a city she had long left behind. Initially, Sophie hesitated. The idea of returning to Paris, with all the memories the city carried, stirred a wave of conflicting emotions. Yet something in her conversations with Ethan, something that had awakened an old restlessness, made her reconsider. Perhaps it was time to revisit the past. Ethan, on the other hand, also received news that seemed like a sign from fate. A retrospective of his films was being organized at the same time, at one of the city's most renowned theaters. Paris, the backdrop of their first encounter, was now poised to be the setting for the reunion of their lives. Fate seemed to be toying with them, as though testing whether time could truly erase certain bonds. Sophie arrived in Paris on a crisp autumn morning. The streets, covered with golden leaves, seemed unchanged from when she had left decades ago. There was a nostalgic familiarity in the air, and yet an unfamiliarity that made her feel like a visitor in a life that was no longer hers. The hotel she had booked overlooked the Seine, and from her window, she could see the serene river flowing slowly beneath the city's bridges. The view brought back memories of nights spent there, when she had been a young woman full of uncertain dreams, gazing at the same river and wondering what kind of future awaited her. Ethan, for his part, was unusually anxious. His retrospective attracted attention from the press and the public, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew Sophie was in Paris, but wasn't sure if he would see her. Although the virtual reunion had been comforting, meeting in person seemed to carry a much heavier weight. What if the feelings they had didn't survive the reality of the present? Finally, the inevitable moment came. Sophie, after much hesitation, decided to attend Ethan's film retrospective. As she entered the theater, she was immediately greeted by the soft soundtracks from the films he had directed over the years. The dim lights and projections on the walls created an intimate, almost surreal atmosphere. For a moment, she felt transported to the set of that romantic film where they had worked together, as if time had curved back and brought them to that instant. When her eyes finally found Ethan, standing at the back of the room, the world around her seemed to slow down. He was older now, his hair gray, the wrinkles on his face etched by decades of experiences and emotions. And yet, his eyes were the same ones that had observed her with intensity and care so many years before. He saw her too, and for a moment neither of them moved. It was as if the reunion had a gravity of its own, pulling them together in silence. Sophie slowly made her way toward him. Each step felt heavy, laden with memories and unspoken expectations. When they finally stood face to face, words seemed inadequate. Both remained still, as though waiting for the other to break the invisible barrier that still separated them. Ethan, always so eloquent in his films, felt that in that moment there was no script that could prepare him for what was to come. Sophie's eyes shone, reflecting a mixture of surprise and recognition. Standing before Ethan, feeling his physical presence, brought a flood of emotion she had carefully tucked away. Both had lived such distant lives, and now here they were, sharing the weight of what could have been and what still could be. In the days following their reunion, Sophie and Ethan met a few more times, always cautiously, but with a growing familiarity. They walked together through the streets of Paris, rediscovering the city under the light of their new lives. They talked about the paths their journeys had taken, about the loves they had lived, the families they had built, and the losses they had endured. Their conversations were deep and intimate, yet there was always a shadow of doubt. Could they really rekindle something that had been interrupted 50 years ago? As the days passed, the intensity of Sophie and Ethan's reunion began to weigh on them both in unexpected ways. Paris, with its timeless beauty and nostalgic memories, enveloped them in an almost inevitable veil of romance. However, behind the walks along the Seine and the long conversations in cafes, there was a growing tension that neither could ignore. Sophie, now a wise and experienced woman, began to question her own feelings. Meeting Ethan again after so many years had stirred something deep within her, and the sense of reconnection was undeniable. Yet, that same reconnection brought uncomfortable doubts. She had built a stable life in Italy with a circle of friends, a flourishing art career, and most importantly, an inner peace that had taken her years to achieve. To relive a love from the past meant, in some way, letting go of part of that stability. On nights alone in her hotel room, Sophie pondered what it would mean to rekindle a relationship with Ethan. She felt fear. Fear that the love she had felt for him in the 1970s was merely an idealization of youth, something that time had transformed into an impossible fantasy to recreate in real life. And beyond that, there was Claire, Ethan's daughter, whose fragile health made Sophie feel that she might become an emotional burden to him. The new responsibilities in their lives weighed more heavily than any feelings from the past. Ethan, meanwhile, was struggling with his own ghosts. The reunion with Sophie had rekindled a flame he believed had long been extinguished by time, but that flame came with a sense of guilt and confusion. For the past decade, he had dedicated his life to caring for Claire, whose degenerative illness limited her independence. As a loving father, Ethan had taken on the responsibility of being constantly by her side. The emotional burden was heavy, but Ethan rarely let it show in public. Talking to Sophie about it for the first time in years, he allowed himself to show the vulnerability he had so long tried to hide. Sophie, in turn, was overwhelmed with compassion. Yet, with that empathy came the realization that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. To reunite with Ethan meant inevitably sharing that weight. She wondered if she was ready to give up the stable life she had built in Italy, to once again enter a scenario where love, as beautiful as it was, came with deep responsibilities and new uncertainties. Doubt crept between them like a shadow, overshadowing the moments of lightness they had experienced in the days before. Sophie began hesitating in her responses, and Ethan noticed that something had changed in her behavior. The long walks became quieter, the conversations more spaced, as if both were avoiding addressing what truly mattered. On a particularly cold evening, as they watched the lights of Paris reflected on the river, Ethan turned to Sophie and, without preamble, asked what was troubling her. He knew she was struggling with something. Sophie, always honest with herself and others, didn't hesitate to open her heart. She spoke of her fears of reliving the past, of the life she had built in Italy, and how she feared that they were trying to force a connection that, though still real, belonged to a different time. She admitted, gently, that she was afraid of entering Ethan's life knowing that his dedication to his daughter was unquestionable, and that perhaps she was being selfish in wanting more than he could offer. Hearing her words, Ethan felt a familiar pain tighten in his chest. He knew Sophie was right in part. The love they shared was indeed a relic of another time, and the responsibilities of their adult lives could not be ignored. But at the same time, he couldn't deny how much Sophie meant to him, how much that reconnection, as complex as it was, had brought light to a part of him he thought he had lost. That moment of honesty between them created a pause. Both knew that what they had was precious, but perhaps too fragile to withstand the pressures of the present. And so, in that heavy silence, the doubt hung over them. Could they balance the feelings that had resurfaced with the new responsibilities and wounds that life had imposed? They both knew a decision would need to be made, but for now, the questions remained unanswered. After that night, the distance between Sophie and Ethan became more evident. Although the affection and connection between them remained, both were immersed in a sea of uncertainties. Sophie decided to spend her remaining days in Paris focusing on her professional obligations, while Ethan stayed close to Claire, whose health had become an increasingly urgent priority. Yet fate, always knowing how to act at the most unexpected moments, was preparing a new twist. On the afternoon before her return to Italy, Sophie decided to take a solitary walk through the streets of Paris, seeking a final moment of reflection. Passing by an old bookstore in the Saint-Germain district, she felt drawn to the window, which displayed rare books and journals from French filmmakers. The nostalgia of the city flooded her, and without much intention, she entered the store, where the scent of old paper immediately enveloped her. The shelves were filled with volumes forgotten by time, and Sophie, unhurried, wandered through the narrow aisles, letting her fingers glide over the spines of the books. That's when one journal in particular caught her attention. The worn leather cover bore the name of a famous French filmmaker from the 1970s, someone she and Ethan had vaguely known during the filming of the movie where they had first met. His name stirred distant memories, and Sophie, curious, began leafing through the yellowed pages. As she read the notes, the familiar descriptions of the behind-the-scenes atmosphere from that era made her smile. However, one specific entry made her stop abruptly. The filmmaker had mentioned Ethan by name. Sophie frowned, intrigued. He wrote about an encounter with Ethan and, more surprisingly, with her. The journal detailed a conversation between the filmmaker and Sophie right after the filming ended, where she, still in Paris, had spoken about her feelings for Ethan. Reading it brought a surge of emotions. In that conversation, Sophie had admitted that she wanted to see Ethan again after the end of the shoot, but had never had the courage to approach him directly. She feared that the interest she felt was not mutual, or that life would take them in different directions, as it ultimately did. The journal revealed that the filmmaker had encouraged Sophie to reach out to Ethan, but the fear of rejection and uncertainty about the future had held her back. Sophie read and reread that entry several times, as if the words from the past were trying to settle in her mind. She had never known that Ethan remembered her with the same intensity, that his feelings had been mutual. In that moment, she realized that all the time they had spent apart was marked by silences and decisions left unmade, not by a lack of feeling. The revelation completely changed her understanding of what had happened between her and Ethan. The hesitations they both carried now seemed lighter, as if the weight of decades of silence had been softened by the truth finally revealed. Still reeling from the discovery, Sophie carefully closed the journal and stood still for a few moments, processing the depth of the revelation. That fragment of the past, so simple, yet so crucial, completely reframed her view of what had occurred between her and Ethan. The uncertainties that had dominated their reunion now seemed to have been lifted, replaced by the knowledge that their feelings had never been forgotten, only hidden by fear. With the journal in hand, Sophie left the bookstore and, without thinking much, headed to Ethan's home. There was something that needed to be said, something she could no longer postpone. When she arrived at his door, her heart was pounding with an almost uncontrollable force, and hesitation briefly haunted her once again. However, with the certainty that this was the right time, she rang the doorbell. Ethan answered, surprised to see her so suddenly. There was something in Sophie's gaze that he couldn't immediately decipher, but it conveyed an urgency, a sense of resolution. She entered and, without preamble, handed him the journal, pointing to the specific passage. Ethan read it in silence, emotion slowly washing over his face as he understood what was before him. For both of them, that moment was more than just a revelation. It was the collapse of a wall that had separated them for 50 years. What they had always imagined as simply a coincidence of life was now revealed to be a series of choices influenced by fear, by silence, and by the unknown. What they thought had been a connection interrupted by external circumstances was, in fact, something they had both allowed to remain dormant out of a lack of courage. When Ethan finished reading, he looked at Sophie with a mixture of astonishment and understanding. The truth, now uncovered, gave new meaning to their reunion. Time, which had once seemed merciless, was now offering them a unique opportunity to rewrite their story. Although 50 years had passed, they felt that something strong, something true, had never disappeared. Observing Ethan's expression, Sophie realized that, despite the fears and responsibilities they both carried, there was a real chance for them to face this new chapter together. She had been shaped by her life in Italy, and he by his responsibilities with Claire, but the love, this love that they had never allowed to fully bloom, was still there, waiting to be lived. It was time for a courageous decision. In the quiet of that afternoon, a sense of clarity settled over Sophie and Ethan. The discovery in the journal, with all its emotional weight, had brought to light something they had both kept dormant for decades. The connection, though buried under years of distance and silence, was still alive. But acknowledging that wasn't enough. They now had to decide what to do with this second chance that fate had given them. Sophie looked at Ethan, feeling the weight of the emotions that their reunion had unleashed. This man, who had once been more than just a director or a passing acquaintance, was now once again standing before her, but the situation was vastly different. There was a new clarity that, despite the passing years, the flame between them still burned. However, that flame came with new responsibilities, new fears, and a profound uncertainty about the future. Ethan, for his part, was conflicted. The revelation in the journal had shaken the balance he had maintained for so many years. He had always believed that the past was just that, a distant memory that could not be changed. Now, with Sophie standing next to him, the past seemed less distant, but the present pressed down on him with an unyielding force. Claire, his daughter with her fragile health, was the center of his life, and Ethan knew he could not simply walk away from that responsibility. Yet, Sophie's presence reignited a feeling he had never expected to feel again. Sophie, in turn, reflected on her own life. She had built something solid in Italy, a life of personal and professional fulfillment that had brought her peace. Still, the prospect of leaving behind what could be her last chance to live a true love with Ethan consumed her. What they shared now was more than nostalgia. It was an opportunity to reclaim something deep, something that had never been fully explored. As Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the streets of Paris, lost in thought, Sophie watched him in silence. She knew his dilemma was real. Claire would always be an inseparable part of his life, and Sophie didn't want to interfere in that bond. But she also knew there was something stronger, a connection that transcended time and circumstance, and that in some way could coexist with the new realities they faced. Deep down, Ethan also understood that, although his life was shaped by his responsibilities to his daughter, there was something in Sophie that he could no longer ignore. The intensity of their reunion, the depth of the emotions he felt for her, made it impossible to continue living as though nothing had changed. He was faced with a difficult but inevitable choice. It wasn't a simple choice between the past and the present, but about how to reconcile the two parts of his life that were now intertwined. With that awareness, Ethan finally turned to Sophie, his eyes reflecting the weight of everything he felt. He knew he couldn't give up his role as a father, but he also couldn't ignore what was blossoming once again between them. Sophie, in turn, understood that the situation demanded more than just a romantic decision. She wasn't expecting Ethan to choose between her and his daughter, nor was she willing to abandon her own life in Italy. Yet, in some way, they both knew there was a path forward. It wouldn't be the idealized dream of youth, full of promises of perfection. It would be a love built on the complexities of their lives, respecting the responsibilities each of them carried. Sophie felt that, although the obstacles were great, what they had rediscovered could not be neglected. The love between them was real, and now more than ever, they were ready to face it with courage. The decision they made in that moment wasn't driven by fantasy or illusion, but by the reality of what they felt and what they knew they could offer each other. It was a courageous choice, to live in the present, to honor the past, but without sacrificing the most important parts of their current lives. They were ready to face the challenges together, in a way that was more mature and conscious than before. With that, they both knew that their story was still being written, and that despite the passage of time, there was still so much left to live. After the decision they made together, a sense of acceptance settled over Sophie and Ethan. They knew the complications of their lives wouldn't disappear, but for the first time, they were ready to face the future with courage. It was time to reconcile the past with the present and build a new reality, without illusions or pressures. Their reunion, unexpected and overwhelming, had brought them a clarity that true love could survive, even after so many years and challenges. Sophie returned to Italy soon after, where her life awaited her. The rolling hills of Tuscany, the studio where she spent hours painting, and the practice where she still treated her patients with empathy and depth. She reintegrated into her routine, but something had shifted inside her. The uncertainties that had once dominated her thoughts about the past had vanished. With Ethan, she had found a way to live in the present without sacrificing what they had built separately. Ethan, for his part, remained in Paris, dedicating himself to his daughter Claire, whose needs continued to demand his constant care. He knew that his place was by her side, but unlike in previous years, he now lived with a new perspective, a renewed sense of purpose. While Claire remained the center of his daily life, there was a space he reserved for Sophie, a space they would learn to share over time. In the months that followed, Ethan began visiting Sophie in Italy more frequently. The trips were carefully planned, ensuring that he could be present for both Claire and this new chapter with Sophie. During these visits, the couple found a harmony that neither of them had anticipated. They walked together through the tranquil landscapes of Tuscany, discussing art, cinema, and the lives that had shaped them so differently. Sophie showed him her favorite places, the small villages where life seemed to slow down and time moved at a gentler pace. Despite the physical distance that often separated them, Ethan and Sophie developed a strong bond, shaped by maturity and acceptance. There was no longer an urgency or desperation to reclaim lost time. There was only an understanding that what they had was rare and therefore should be cherished. Over time, Ethan's life began to intertwine with Sophie's in subtle and gradual ways. Without the expectation of perfection, they allowed themselves to live a love that, although late, was authentic and conscious. Sophie's home in Italy became a refuge for both of them. During his visits, Ethan discovered new passions, influenced by the artistic world that surrounded Sophie. He, in turn, brought with him his filmmaker's eye, and together they collaborated on small projects. Sophie inspired him to photograph the Tuscan landscapes, the vibrant colors and soft contrasts that had once gone unnoticed by his eyes accustomed to the urban. And thus, the art that had always quietly united them became a tangible bond between them. There were, of course, the challenges they both knew they would face. Claire remained a constant presence in Ethan's life, and her fragile health made him hesitant about the idea of moving permanently to Italy. However, Sophie understood this responsibility. She never demanded that he make a drastic decision, and they continued building a relationship based on trust and mutual respect for the lives they had each built. As time passed, Sophie and Ethan found a kind of balance. His visits became more frequent, and eventually Ethan began spending longer periods in Italy, bringing Claire with him on some occasions when her health allowed. Italy, with its calm beauty and slower pace, offered not only a refuge for Ethan and Sophie but also for Claire, who found peace in the hills and in Sophie's presence. Sophie's sensitivity as a psychologist helped Claire cope with her illness in a lighter way. Their new beginning was built on the acceptance that life, with all its uncertainties, would always require adjustments. They didn't live a fairy tale, but rather a real love story, adapted to their realities and limitations. Over time, what had once seemed like an impossible reunion became a natural part of their lives. A life shared between Paris and Florence, between the past and the present. And so, Sophie and Ethan lived this new chapter fully, respecting the rhythm of the love they had rediscovered. There was no more fear, only the certainty that, for hearts truly connected, time, no matter how cruel, could never be an insurmountable barrier. They had proven that, despite the adversities and challenges accumulated over 50 years, true love, patient and mature, was capable of overcoming time and finding its way back. As they traveled together through the beautiful European landscapes they loved so much, they knew that, although time could not be undone, they had found, in the maturity of their years, something more valuable: the courage to fully live what had once been only an unfulfilled promise. The story of Sophie and Ethan shows us that even when life seems to take us down different paths, love has a way of defying time. For 50 years, their connection lay dormant, but when they rediscovered it, they found that the feelings never truly faded. Their journey reminds us that, even though our lives may take unexpected turns, it's never too late to find a second chance at love, if we're brave enough to embrace it. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with others who might find inspiration in Sophie and Ethan's journey. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore love, life, and the power of destiny. And keep following along for more emotional journeys that remind us of the unexpected ways in which life can bring people back together.